So young John Stuart Mill and young Harriet Taylor entered into a period of great torment. They were both recently discovered romantics, recently discovered romantically in love with each other, and troubled by the fact that Harriet Taylor had a husband. So first, Mr. Taylor gave them permission to go off and live their lives together and leave him in England. He would be fine. He wasn't troubled by this. He was an old man and he was beyond all the worries about sex. So they tried it. But Harriet was stricken by conscience. Terrible, terrible conscience. So they came back to England and waited for Mr. Taylor to shuffle off this mortal soil, which inevitably he did do. So now we're up to 1840. So his father died in 1836. So if we're up to 1840, then this guy's in his mid-30s. And you'd ask, well, what is he doing? Writing. He can write. He can submit articles just like his father did. He's going to know practically every editor in London. They're all going to know him. He's grown up in front of them. Here he is now, 35. Among the pleasures of this period, the principal one was the incomparable friend of whom I have already spoken. At this period she lived mostly with one young daughter in a quiet part of the country, and only occasionally came to town with her husband, Mr. Taylor. I visited her equally in both places, and was greatly indebted to the strength of character which enabled her to disregard the false interpretations liable to be put on the frequency of my visits to her while living generally apart from Mr. Taylor. So here's the story. So he falls in love with a lady who was much younger than her husband, to whom she'd been married for many years, apparently okay with him, and having some kids. And they're now just sort of living their own lives, and he's perfectly happy with that. And Mr. 35-year-old J.S. Mill starts to meet Mrs. Taylor and find her very interesting, and now he starts to visit her a lot. And he adds, I visited her equally in both places and was greatly indebted to the strength of character which enabled her to disregard the false interpretations. Well, the interpretations were that a young guy was falling in love with Mrs. Taylor, who was married to Mr. Taylor. There was nothing false about this. They were falling in love with each other. There was nothing false about the interpretations. Neighbors who saw him visiting Mrs. Taylor in both places frequently said, well, that J.S. Mill guy's falling in love with Mrs. Taylor. And they were right. So all the huffing and the puffing in his comments and autobiography are so hilarious and all for show because, of course, bottom line, they were falling in love. Here's the details. We sometimes traveled together, though in all other respects our conduct during those years gave not the slightest ground for any other supposition than the true one, that our relation to each other at that time was one of strong affection and confidential intimacy only. Oh, it wasn't that we were falling in love with each other. Oh, no, don't put any false interpretations. Oh, no. We weren't falling in love with, oh, no. We just had strong affection. Don't you love it? I mean, it's so filled with delusion. For though we did not consider, but remember, this guy was homeschooled, protected by Papa to the age of 20-something, and most likely 30-something. And he's totally inexperienced and doesn't know how to pursue a romance. He's not a Byronic character. He's not pursuing his romance like a Byron would do. He's going to tippy-toe around like Wordsworth would do, out in the woods, tippy-toeing through the daffodils and picking a daffodil for her and having strong affection. I'm just being mean. I know we all love Wordsworth. We sometimes travel together. Imagine that. For though we did not consider the ordinances of society binding on a subject so entirely personal, we did feel bound that our conduct should be such as in no degree to bring discredit on Mr. Taylor, nor therefore on herself. This was totally true. Everything they did was to protect her husband. What they knew pretty quick was they were madly in love, and what they wanted to do was what lovers do, but they didn't do it because they didn't want anyone to think they were doing it. But everybody did think they were doing it, even though they tried to pretend like they weren't doing it. They weren't doing it, but they might as well have started doing it. So in 1833, they both wrote essays on marriage. Isn't that typical? And in these essays, Taylor and Mill discuss the ethical questions of marriage, separation, and divorce. Taylor insists that what needs to be done to raise the condition of women is to remove all interference with affection or with anything which is, or which even might be supposed to be, demonstrative of affection. She criticized the fact that women are educated for one single object, to gain their living by marrying. Doesn't that sound like Jane Austen? Of course. There's all the Austen novels, and they're all about these strong-willed, well-educated, independent women who are living in a society where you have to get married, and in the various Austen novels you get all the varieties of problems. Some of them get married in the last line. Sometimes the last page gives you Darcy, kissing her. In the movie, it's in the rain. So they're both thinking about marriage, and they're both thinking about what they want to do is get rid of old Mr. Taylor. Mrs. Taylor criticized the fact that women are educated for one single object, to gain their living by marrying, that to be married is the object of their existence, and that if the object being gained, they do really cease to exist as to anything worth calling life or any useful purpose. So Mrs. Taylor has formed a pretty cynical view of marriage by mid-century. She criticized the hypocrisy and unfairness of the fact that any girl who is seen as suitable for marriage is, because only virgins are seen as suitable, by that very fact completely ignorant as to what marriage entails. She argues for rights to divorce. Now, why is she arguing all this? Because she wants to get rid of Mr. Taylor and get her hands on this hot Mr. J.S. Mill. That's what she wants. But she's got to write it as a general essay. I wonder what Mr. Taylor thought about all this. In 1833, the Taylors agree to a trial separation. 1833. So he's been cavorting around, well, I suppose since 1830, since he starts talking about her. So a couple of years. Been riding the trains of England, being this very good friend. Finally, in 1833, they agree on a trial separation. And she goes off to Paris. Guess who else goes off to Paris? Mr. J.S. Mill, and meets her. And despite evidently being extremely happy there with Mr. J.S. Mill, Taylor is then conscience-stricken about Mr. Taylor. So clearly, the two of them go off to Paris and finally do what they've wanted to do for years, and have a lot of fun. Then, of course, in her condition of funness, she feels sad, poor Mr. Taylor. So I'm sure J.M. Mill was less than happy with this. She decides to go back to London and move it back in with Mr. Taylor, agreeing that they will live as husband and wife in the house, foregoing sexual intimacy with either guy. Now, isn't that hilarious? I mean, what a stupid solution. What a stupid solution. They ought to either let herself go back to being Mr. Taylor's wife, or tell Mr. Taylor she's going to go off to a country house and live with Mr. J.S. Mill and live as his wife. But there wouldn't have been a divorce, of course. Why didn't they just do that? Oh, no. She has to basically be a phony for the rest of Mr. Taylor's life, pretending to be his wife, but of course not be. He finally died in 1849. Now, 1849 means 16 years that Mrs. Taylor and Mr. Mill take train rides together. 16 years. And then, finally, Mr. Taylor died in 1849, and they still waited 2 years. So, here these two revolutionary writers, and both of whom are so caught up in the appropriate behavior, they wait 2 years for what they've been waiting for 16. They didn't want to create a scandal. They get married in 1849. They will have not even 10 years. She gets sick in 1857. They're in France because they go to live to travel. He wants to study in some library, but basically they want to get out of England, so everybody, will leave him alone. And she died in 1858. So they wasted 16 years when they could have been together happily. And there he is all by himself in 1858. Devastated, of course. There she is in Avignon. And both of them are buried in this cemetery in Avignon, France. So if you make a trip to Europe, you can go and visit their tomb. This is the tomb of Harriet Taylor, but he's buried next to her.